All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. We are going to start our webinar, and this is part of the Reimagining Prevention webinar series, moving upstream to support and promote child and family well-being. And today we are honored to be joined by Junious Williams as he shares the Collective Impact Community Engagement Toolkit. So today Junious is going to really lead us through how do you engage community through a lens of equity. The partners in this webinar are the Department of Social Services, the California Training Institute, and Strategies TA. My name is Lydia Marquez. I'm going to be your facilitator today, and I'm from Strategies TA. The goal of this series is to really share this larger vision for safety, prevention, and early intervention for California, impact change by teaching common principles across diverse agencies through webinars and learning conversations. So really building capacity around prevention and looking at prevention in all aspects of the work. Lift the importance of equity and community engagement as foundational prevention principles. So we'll talk more about that this afternoon. Give guidance to new initiatives that move services upstream to support and strengthen families, and promote a continuum of care for children, youth, mothers, fathers, and caregivers. This Reimagining Prevention webinar series is centered around Assembly Bill 153 for the comprehensive prevention planning, moving upstream towards primary prevention, change management to support successful, sustained implementation, and community engagement that fosters innovative, collaborative prevention efforts across all systems in California. This is a roadmap for comprehensive prevention planning, and you'll see just this spectrum of what that work will look like. And community engagement is part of the guidance and information part of the readiness for comprehensive prevention planning. What's next? So after this webinar, you will receive a survey link in the chat. We will follow up with you with an email that will have the webinar materials attached. So if you hear something, if we share resources or links, that will all be in there. So, you don't have to furiously write anything down. We will make sure that we follow up with all of the resources we share today, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint and also the Collective Impact Community Engagement Toolkit. You can also find more information on these websites, and we'll also share those in the follow-up emails. So please feel free to see those the next time we contact you. So without further ado, I want to present Junious Williams, and I will allow him to go ahead and take it away. Let me get his slideshow up. I'm ready for him. Okay, so Junious.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, and thanks to other staff at Strategies, TA, CDSS, and Caltrans. We were able a week or so ago to kind of do a preview session where staff from those three agencies were able to walk through the Collective Impact Community Engagement Toolkit and to provide some advice on how best to structure this particular session. So I'm going to essentially present a toolkit to you. We're going to supplement that with some presentations from staff that focus on what are the requirements that are driving the need to have community engagement. And also to talk about some resources that are available, some of which you may have seen already, some new ones that will help you on the work that you need to get accomplished in the next 6 or 7 months. What we're going to do is I'm going to run through the tool kit, kind of providing an overview, and then I'll go back and I want to specifically drill down into something called the spectrum of community engagement. In my work, what I found is that where a lot of initiatives have difficulty is they don't do the sort of planning and assessment of where they are and what they're willing and able to do around community engagement. So I want to spend some time and give you some time in some breakout groups to look at the spectrum of community engagement tool, because you really need to situate where the work is going to be and what your organizations or collaboratives are able to do in terms of how much or how far along that spectrum you're able to move. Um, so we're going to do the walkthrough, then we'll have some time in small groups. We'll come back together and get a sense of what some of the discussion was in the small group. Then, as I said, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what are the requirements around community engagement and some of the resources. And then we'll spend the remaining time just I'm going to offer some recommendations about how I would attack the problem. I'm going to hold those not where they are on the agenda, but a little later in case there are other things that come up in the discussion that I'd like to make some suggestions to you on. So that's sort of the agenda. I tend to move fast. Don't let that stop you. If you want to ask a question, you can use the chat or you can raise your hand, and I'd ask my colleagues from Strat TA to help me monitor the chat as questions come up if I need to pause and address those. So that's sort of the agenda. Again, welcome everyone. And where we're going to start is it would be helpful, and Lydia, I think you have the Menti set up
I
for the
do.
group. Yeah, we're going to do two Mentis. Menti is this, it's basically a little survey tool that kind of measures sentiment. I'm sure you've seen it. Given the frequency of various responses, it gives you a picture, a word picture of how people are responding with the number of responses reflected in the size. So we're going to do two of them that hopefully will be helpful to all of us. And you see them just by way, sorry, I didn't mention it. You should have a participant agenda as well as a copy of the deck and a copy of the collective impact tool. Those are available online. And whenever we're doing breakouts or doing something like Menti, your agenda will have the specific survey question or discussion questions in case you're not able to see the screen. So with that, we're going to do two rounds of Menti surveying, and then we'll come back and do a little interpreting of each. On the first one, I want you to list words that identify what are the greatest challenges that you're encountering in terms of pursuing community engagement, and we'll do one Menti of that and get a picture of what your sentiment looks like on that. And then on the second one, I want you to think about and list words that identify the greatest opportunities that community engagement. So the first one is up in the chat. You'll see the code to the Menti. And why don't we go ahead and get you started on the first. What are your greatest, these are the opportunities. The first one is what are the greatest challenges? So with that, why don't you go ahead and complete the Menti, and then we'll come back in just a couple of minutes and we'll see what the results are.
So you can actually go on your, sorry, go on your phone if you want and just type in menti.com and then enter the code. It will bring up. So there's two questions to engage with. So please feel free to do both if you'd like while you're there.
Okay, we'll give you a couple minutes then to figure out the navigation and to post your responses. And if you have more than one, that's fine. As many as you want to generate is fine.
And then Genius, I think some folks are having a little bit of trouble hearing, so
Oh,
I'm not
hearing
sure.
me?
Yes.
Let me go to my controls and see what I can do. Is that better?
It sounds the same to me, but I'm wearing a headset, so some people might want to.
Junius, you might have to just come closer to your computer. It might just be the microphone.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My mic has gotten
Oh,
turned.
that's
That's
sounds better.
better.
Sorry
Thank you.
about that. Didn't do that adjustment.
No
Thank
worries.
you. If other people are having technical hearing or seeing, please let us know and we'll try to adjust.
So what we see, the words that are being used multiple times tend to be larger and will bold. So we see a lot of folks that are answering using, or I guess reporting diversity and equity as the greatest opportunities in person community engagement.
Okay.
And then we can go to the next one whenever you're ready, Junius.
Okay, I see some people are still coming in. So why don't we see? So we've got voice, equity, and diversity being three of the greatest opportunities that seem to be repetitively cited, but a lot of other items have been mounted. So we'll come back and get a snapshot of these for you. But let's look at the other one and see what people are citing as the challenges.
We're starting to see some
Yeah, they're starting to populate here.
starting to pop up here. Well, it looks like time is really standing out here. If only we could clone ourselves. They're cloning cats, hopefully. I don't know if they're gonna, I don't know if we're next human services staff, but time, trust, cultural differences, and coordination seem to be some of the most answered question or most answered responses.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all for participating. That was just great to see the visual of some of the challenges and opportunities.
I want to make a couple comments though, and especially about the first one. What I noticed about the opportunities is that what did not rise to the top and should in your calculations is impact. You get better impact when you're engaging people. And I know that the catalyst may well be demands for diversity and equity and representation, and all those are fine. But central to doing this is you're going to get better, more sustainable outcomes when you engage a wide spectrum of people in identifying the problem and figuring out what the best strategies are and becoming committed to implementing whatever the interventions are. You're going to produce big results. So I know that there's a lot of chatter that this is purely, checking the box sort of stuff. If it's that, you're going to lose the greatest benefit, which is time and again, people find out they get better, more sustainable interventions and strategies out of this process. And when you engage the community, you also get the longer term commitment from the community, because if it's something that they help to craft and that they believe in, long after we've gone on to the next assignment, the community's going to be there and continue to pursue that. So for me, the number one factor here, as much as I appreciate the equity and the diversity and all the other benefits, the number one thing is we're going to get better results. And that should drive the work to people who are committed to sort of the mission in the work. On the other side, you're right. This is more time consuming. There's nothing we can say about that. It's going to require more time and effort on the part of staff. It may require some different sort of staff or different partnerships with people. But yeah, time is a big factor, because this is not as rapid a process as when we make top-down administrative decisions, when we as organizations already, because we're in contact with each other continually and reinforcing the messages, when we get ready to move alone as a single organization, yes, it's much more rapid, and the top-down structure permits somebody in an organization usually to make a decision and move things. You're not going to get that here. So you need to be prepared that this is going to be a somewhat slower process. Now, we'll talk a little bit about a couple of techniques, but I think Paul terms it in the workbook or in the toolkit as patient urgency, right? That you have to create, because people want to see movement, but you need to be patient enough to make sure that you put the scaffolding and the foundation in place to make sure that you're going to be successful. Otherwise, you've added an additional time burden and you've diminished your results, which is the worst possible outcome of trying to do the collaborative work. There's a trade-off in time, but it should be more than accounted for by the effectiveness of what you come up with. So just a couple of words, and want to keep those in mind. So if people have questions as we go on, or comments about this notion in terms of challenges, trust and time, and addressing cultural differences and coordination, and then in the prior one, equity and diversity. So I'm going to stop there and kind of jump into the main, if you'll go back to the deck, Lydia. So here's just a table of contents for to help you navigate the deck, where you'll find various materials. I'm not going to go exhaustively through all of the slides, but you will have them if you want to refer back later. Next slide, please. Okay, here are the outcomes. They're also on your agenda. One of the things that I want us to try to focus on today, and we've already started with the Menti exercises, try to not only identify challenges and opportunities in the work, but try to share with each other strategies that people have found effective in overcoming those challenges or pursuing opportunities. It's important to understand the context of why people are pushing for this greater level of community engagement. We've already started talking about that. It's about results, and there's pretty good evidence that the more inclusive you are, the better the results are that come from the work. We want to get you into an overview of the toolkit and talk a bit about how you might put it to use, and then finally identify some sources of the requirements for community engagement, so you know what the targets are for the work, as well as some resources that will help you. Next slide. Next slide's just the agenda, and you have it on your document, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. Next slide, please. Okay, so I already started this a little bit, but here's a slide just talking about what some of the reasons are for engaged people with lived experience or lived expertise. I've already mentioned understanding kind of the systemic nature of the challenges in the community. And again, one of the things we're learning about all of this work, yeah, there may be a bad actor here or there, and that we need to effectively manage and improve their behavior, but we're talking about systemic and structural problems. So no matter what we do in programs and services, we need to keep an eye on what are the systemic and structural factors that are affecting bad outcomes, in your case on child abuse and prevention, but no matter what the problem. Secondly, it's this notion of co-creating the solutions. We spend a lot of time historically going into our bureaucratic maze and figuring out something to do for or at community. And really, to find the sustainable solutions, you need to be able to touch and view the problem from all of the perspectives that are available through the community to really understand it and to figure out effective strategies. Sometimes we're just going in to verify direction. That's sort of a minimal level of community engagement, but it may be an important one. If you can't erect all the scaffolding to do this comprehensively, consistently, and intensively, it does give you an opportunity, even if you're going out to consult the community, and you'll understand this language a little more when we look at the spectrum, it at least gives you an opportunity to learn that, oh my goodness, everybody thinks we're completely off the wall in this. Maybe it's a cause for us to stop and step back and reconsider and maybe recalibrate what we're doing. Hearing from the beneficiaries and hearing how they interpret something that we want to do by virtue or by way of strategy or intervention is an important kind of checkpoint for us. It can also, though, expand the reach of the strategies. When people have been engaged in planning and figuring out what the strategies are, they get a sense of ownership, and that's really important. And a number of people said this work is about building trust. Well, one of the ways of building trust is for people to be listened to feel like they had something to do with what it is we've decided to do, and then the concomitant commitment that they have to saying, I want to make what we came up with successful. And then finally, there's this notion about we need to be building capacity in the community, in bureaucracies, in nonprofit organizations to lead collaborative and sustainable change. And oftentimes when we talk about training, we sort of turn and look at the community. They ain't the only ones who need their skill levels upgraded. I would argue that when people who have had these experiences with our bureaucracies stay at the table, it's testimony to their resiliency and their learning, right? And oftentimes they don't need any. They've adjusted and navigated sometimes our idiotic bureaucracy. So, it's not saying that nobody in the stakeholder group of community needs any capacity, but I would argue we need to look at ourselves first and build our own capacities to do this work more effectively. And we'll find that when we do that, we're also building the trust and confidence of the community to work with us. So those are some of the reasons why it's important to engage community, all of which are around not checking off the box on equity or on inclusion, but about making the work more effective. Next slide. One of the things that you need to do early on, I use the language stakeholder group, and this is just a diagram that I use that's a generic one. But one of the things you're going to need to do early on is to figure out and not stop talking amorphously, as I've been doing, about stakeholder groups and get very specific about who the stakeholder groups are that you need to identify, understand what's going on with them, and engage them in the collaborative effort. On the left side of this chart, we almost traditionally navigate when we start talking about sectors or stakeholders. There's government, there's philanthropy, there's for-profits, all of that's true, but there are also community-based organizations and residents, and I separate them because they're not synonymous. Sometimes community-based organizations are practicing bad approaches that rival government, right? They don't have residents and intended beneficiaries on their board. They don't have mechanisms for voice. They're not doing collaborative, and that's okay. I'm saying all of us have got room to improve. What I am saying, though, is they may or may not be the route to genuine resident engagement, and that's what you want. Some component of. These are people who are not aligned with any of the organizations or any of the public bureaucracies. Their primary reason and purpose for being there is that they represent intended beneficiaries. They represent neighborhood allies. They represent the people that we're trying to reach. And it's very important to flesh out what those stakeholder groups are. And as you'll see more as we get into using the tool, getting very specific about what the strategies and approaches are for engaging those particular stakeholder groups, because they're likely to differ. And as you well know, and people have already raised, when you talk about residents, you have a dimension of our diversity by race and ethnicity and gender. Someone in the earlier Menti mentioned that there's an obligation to reach out to tribal governments. So all of that is about really understanding with specificity who the stakeholder groups are, and beyond the generics of residents. So are we talking about Southeast Asian populations in our community who may be experiencing language barriers? Are we talking about Black folks, or are we talking about Latino community? Who are the specifics when we talk about residents, so that we're sure we're getting the broad representation? Next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to do is to take us on a quick tour through the entire community engagement toolkit, and then I'm going to come back and really drill down to with the spectrum of community engagement, because I think it's the most important tool, because how you use that tool can set the trajectory for how stuff is going to work. And when we get into it, I'll explain more about that. So this tool was developed by my colleague Paul Schmitz at the Collective Impact Forum, and I find it, and you've got the link to the full kit, it's available to you. So what Paul has done in this tool is he's assembled 12 tools in this toolkit. Well, actually, there are 14. There are 2 in the appendix that are in some ways extremely important as well. So what I want to do is to quickly walk through and give you an overview of what's in the entire toolkit, and then we'll come back and I want to drill down, and we'll do an exercise related to the spectrum of community engagement. So next slide. Keep going. Yeah, I'm not going to go through the introductory. Well, I'm going to stop here. Go back one. So one more. Yeah. Be result driven and being purposeful. Too many times when I'm brought in, or when I'm engaging, working with people around community engagement, the problem is that they had no clear idea. It was amorphous why they were doing it. That's going to get you in trouble. You need to be very specific on what the result is and the purpose is that you're pulling people together to try to figure out how to do community engagement. So you'll see in Paul's toolkit, and you'll see me repeatedly coming back to this, know what you're trying to do and who you're trying to do it with. And remember that stakeholder is not a monolithic term, that you need to disaggregate that into understanding, as Paul calls them, audiences, as I call them, subgroups or population. But that's an important starting point. You need to be result driven, that this is going to help us produce some outcome or result that's important, and we've got a specific purpose in doing that, which helps to organize one's thinking and the strategies and the way that you go about it. Next slide. And you'll find in Paul's toolkit that he's got some just charts and tables and tools for you to kind of work through and jot down notes and so forth. And as he says, and just a note on all of these materials, you'll see that they're not copyrighted. We use the Creative Commons, which lets people reproduce and use these tools as much as they want, as long as you don't do it for your own personal profit. So it's kind of quasi-public domain. You just need to give attribution to whoever the author is. You don't need to get copyright permission. Next slide. So that's the first tool. This is the second tool, and you've probably seen various forms of this. Paul modified the original tool. And let me just say a couple words, because there's another version of this that I want to use with you because I think it's more effective. But essentially what the spectrum says, I'm sorry, I didn't mute my phone from yesterday. My apologies. So what this tool says is that there's a lot of different reasons why people are doing some engagement. All the way from placating people to simply informing them, to really consulting and trying to get some feedback, really involving them, over to collaboration, all the way to empowerment. I like this one, but it's simplified to me, and I think for your use, there's a better one, and I'm going to come back to it. But the point is, and I'll keep making this, you need to decide what it is that your collaborative is going to be able to do. And that may be talking to a board of directors or a board of supervisors. It may be talking to leadership within your agency, but you really need to be able to say, here's where we're situating our work. We're going to collaboration only. We're not offering the community an opportunity to own what it is that we create. Or it might be, and this may be appropriate for some things, this is simply informing folks that a decision has been made for whatever reason. We didn't do a lot of collaborating with people, but we want to inform folks of the decision that we made. That's the other side of the spectrum. There may be times for that there are decisions that really aren't subject to a lot of negotiations and input, but there's still an obligation to inform people that those decisions have been made. Again, we'll come back, but this is really critical to figure out not only what the result is that you're trying to achieve and what the purpose of engagement is, but also what you're promising the community. Because if you promise more than you deliver, you actually put yourself in a worse position. As people noted before, there are trust problems with many segments of the community that those of us who lead or engage in bureaucracies come with. The worst thing that you can do is put out that, oh, we're going to do this, this, and this with community, and they don't see anything resembling, collaborating or empowering. What they see is people coming and telling them what they're going to do, and once in a while asking, do you have an opinion? That's really going to dissipate whatever trust is left and put you in a worse position. So this is important to get leadership and everybody on board early that this is what we're willing to do, this is what we're offering, and then to behave consistently with whatever that level of community engagement is that you've promised. And again, we'll come back because I want to show you what I think is a better tool. Next slide. And again, Paul has provided some places for you to kind of think through where you're at. And we're going to do an exercise and put you into some small groups or breakout groups a little later on this. Next slide. Asset-based community development. There has been a movement since the 1960s led by two scholars, Kritzman and McKnight, that formed the asset-based community development movement. And their basic premise is pretty simple. We tend to go into communities with this deficit orientation, and we can figure out and name everything that's bad in that community. And that has led us, and it's also propelled by the fact that much funding is based on pathology and problems. So all of that conspires to have people thinking only about these neighborhoods and communities and groups in terms of their deficit. What asset-based community development says, stop, that's silly. These communities and the fact that they are surviving means that there's a bunch of assets that people have brought to bear to navigate our sometimes silly-ass bureaucracies to stabilize and support the communities. And if we don't go in with an eye toward figuring out who are the natural leaders, what are the assets and resources, what has the community already figured out and has some natural sort of interventions going on, if we go in and ignore all that and just talking about this problem or that problem, we further dismantle our credibility, because those folks know they got some asset. They know better than we do what the problems are. And if we only focus on that, we do ourselves and those communities great injury. So what asset-based community development says, let's start there. If there's stuff already going on in the community to address the problem, let's honor and understand that, because they got there by virtue of some problem analysis and understanding of things, and we shouldn't come in and blindly substitute our own judgment for that community wisdom. What we'll also find is we need to elevate and support leadership that's going on, good strategies, good organizations, all of the things that makes that neighborhood or that community a community, rather than saying we got to go in and change everything. So that's really what the movement is about. And what you'll find, there's a great manual that Kretzmann and McKnight, it must be in its 5th edition now, but really talks people through how you take on an asset-based community development sort of approach and make it work. Next tool, please. Okay. Yeah, and here, this one is a tool, a great assessment tool. And basically what this tool says is you need to continuously monitor and assess where you're at in terms of who is at the table. And obviously there are stakeholder groups, there's ethnic diversity, there's gender, there's other sort of elements of intersectionality that you want to make sure that you manage. But one of the things that Paul does in this tool that I really like is who's at the table in terms of their proximity to the problem. So you'll see at the center of this, he says, this is really about intended beneficiaries or the issue or the neighborhood, however you framed it. But then what he says around the 4 corners is he wants to know, where are people sitting at the table relative to their experience with the issue? Are they intended beneficiaries in that inner circle? Are they in the personal lived experience with the issue? Do they have family who are directly experiencing the issue? Or do they have no direct experience with the issue? You get it. What's their proximity to the problem or issue? Over here, demographic relevance, the same sort of thing. Are they similar people, similar to the target population? Do they represent other historically disadvantaged groups so that they might have some insight into what's going on? Or are they not from any historically disenfranchised group? Geographic relevance. Do the people live there? Have they ever lived there where we're talking about? And do they have direct engagement? This is a great tool to sit down and look at some of your current or past tables and just plot it out on one of these tools and see what it tells you about how you have organized tables in the past, so that you know a little bit about your practice. Or you can also use it when you're sitting down to think about composing a new table. This is one way of thinking about who's being invited to the table and pooling people in terms of making sure that you've got ample representation of issue experience, demographic relevance, geographic relevance, and direct engagement. They're a better copy of this tool. I had to do some manipulating to get it. Next slide, please. But great tool to assess past tables or to plan for tables that you're composing. Just a little bit better one. And then what he does here is this is just a chart for you to summarize, right? What you find when you map out people's connection to the work. Next slide. Okay. One of the things that no matter how representative the group is, that we all need to be guarding against blind spots that we have either individually or collectively. And again, a good anecdote for that is to have a broad representation. The broader the representation, the more likely you are for somebody to raise a blind spot because they bring a perspective that's somewhat different than the group. So that's a really important element of this. And a lot of blind spots result from our inculcated biases, because biased narratives are all over and expanded by our insanity right now with social media, but the bad narratives are out there. We all carry some implicit biases, so the likelihood that we're going to have blind spots is pretty great, and you just need to put in place tools and mechanisms to stop yourself and ask you whether or not you're doing those. Understanding disparities and the root causes of the disparities is one of the most important activities that you're going to engage. And again, it's one that is absolutely essential to have representation. Depending upon one's status and the group identities, you can have a totally different experience in America about some fundamental realities. One that all of us know right now is policing. Depending upon who you are, you can have diametrically opposed feelings about what the police are. Some people who've been the beneficiaries of privilege because of race, because of gender, because of whatever, view them as protectors and the people who are I'm gonna call when there's a problem. But you've got other people with different experiences, like black folks, who are saying, well, let me wait a minute. Are they going to exacerbate the problem? These are the old slave catchers, right? They're the progeny of the slave catchers. I don't know if I can count on them. Those are somewhat diametrically opposed positions that come from the people's lived experience with that institution. So again, it's really important that we understand that those things go on, and that when we're trying to do root cause analysis, we need to bring that to bear, that people have an understanding, and especially people who have been marginalized and victimized by our patterns of discrimination. It's really important to understand the historical and contemporary context in which they understand the problem. That's how we're going to find the solution. It doesn't mean that other folks' assessments are invalid. It just means that there are multiple perspectives, and those perspectives need to be brought to bear when figuring out the strategies, because it may be that for any of a number of reasons, we need to have multiple strategies, some of which address maybe the perception and the behavior of people from a dominant group, some others that might target specifically on what's happening with the subpopulation. Implicit bias and the ladder of inference, let me say quickly, and I thought I put it here, there are, if you haven't been to the Harvard implicit assessment testing site, go there. There are implicit bias tests on almost every sort of bias that we engage in, and it's a really awakening experience for people to go in and see where their biases may lie. And again, all of them have them. I somehow, over the course of my adulthood, went from being from a relatively poor working class family to having elements of bias against working class folks. So again, this is not to castigate anybody. It's just saying you need to put in places checks on our behavior so that we know and are always looking to minimize letting bias creep in. And again, the ladder of inference on the next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but all of the research that was done by Hahnemann, for which he got a Nobel Prize, is based in this, that there are reality and facts, and then we do some selection on those realities. We overlay them with our interpretation, and then those narratives are out there, have formed a base of assumptions that are likely to be what we operate. Let me cut to the chase. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings, and that we pull together all the evidence and we make a decision. 95% of the time, that ain't what we're doing. Those mental narratives that are running around in our head get us to a quick decision because we're not contemplating everything. We're trying to make decisions on the move, and in order to do that, you have to go with some assumptions, with some narratives, with some experience. So it's just saying all of us do that, but how do we, in these processes, put in place checks and guards so that everybody doesn't operate on their most basic base instincts, but we have a process that brings people together to question each other about what the underlying facts and assumptions are. Next tool, please. Okay, and again, assessing audiences is going back, and again, I call them stakeholder group, Paul calls them audiences, but what he's arguing here and what is absolutely essential is now we're not talking amorphously about all stakeholder groups. We're going to get very specific. Who's out there that we want to make sure gets represented and we get the best of their thinking. So you see, intended beneficiaries, the actual people whose lives we want to impact, their families, neighbors, because even though we get very specific and very family as a unit, you know better than I do, the unit of analysis is actually neighborhood and community. That controls a lot of what's going to happen with families and children. What is it that the neighborhood provides in terms of supports and safety, in terms of advantages and opportunity? All those things may be as important as what happens in the individual family because it creates a context. So again, going through and being very specific about who the intended beneficiaries are, what their contribution is, why should they or do they care, and how will they benefit from coming to the table. In a sense, going through each of these audiences. Next slide. And again, Paul's just flagging some potential sub-audience, faith leaders, civic leaders, volunteers, general public. You need to do that generation yourself to figure out what are those populations, and subgroups or audiences in your community. Next slide, please. Okay. And then this is just a strategy tool to figure out, once you know the audiences, what's your specific approach to them. And again, this is something that we don't often do. We tend to jump ahead and jump into the work. It's just a cautionary note. And Paul's reflecting this is sit down and plan. We know there's urgency, but you need to be patient to make sure you're putting the right pieces in place to enhance your likelihood of success. Next. Yeah, and these are just more on your audiences for your priority group and how you're going to approach them. Next slide. Okay. So this slide and this section of the toolkit is just some tips where Paul has just laid out some things for us to think about. I'm not going to go through them, but I do recommend that you read them, because this is a good summary and checklist of things where people often have problems, and he's just warning people to think about these elements before you get too far down the road. Next. I'm hurrying along because I do want to give us some time in the small groups, and I need to come back. Yeah, this is still the same tool for the tips. Next slide. And Paul makes an important point here. While much of this is about engaging individuals who are representative of groups, he's also, though, cautioning us that this is still about organizational partnerships, right? So, for example, you can do all you want and have good relations, but I'm working with a group right now in Ohio where they've gotten so focused on the individual, they've lost partnerships, and they wanted to do a community survey for their community health needs assessment, and they're not getting responses. Well, part of it, and this is my analysis to them, is you don't have partnerships with organizations. And you can't just wade into community and say, we're going to survey folks with some group from North Carolina. This is a time where you need partnerships with community groups who can say to folks, hey, we're working with the North Carolina people on doing this survey. Please respond. It's going to, you know where it goes. That's a result of having organizational partnerships, and those are different than the individual relationships you're developing with people around the table. So Paul's making the point here is don't neglect your partnerships, because you need those for some of the work. When you're starting to figure out who is it that we might invite from a particular subpopulation or audience, who are you going to go to? Well, usually it's your partner organizations who have long-term roots and relationships in that community, and they can say, hey, if you're going to try to do something with that community, go talk to Miss Jones first, because she's the gatekeeper. She's a natural leader. If she gives you the okay, you're in. If you mess up with her, you ain't going to work there. You know, it's those sort of things that these organizational relationships can help to expedite some work, so you aren't going on, I'm just using an example, running around West Oakland asking who's in charge, who are the key figures, who are the people who are influencers. You're going to some organizations who can help you effectively navigate that work quickly. Next slide, please. And again, these are just part of the tools. Just back for a moment, and I'm not going to go through it all again, but it's the next slide, I'm sorry. Paul has a thing here that takes you through patient urgency and momentum, and he makes the point that, wow, you need to be careful. This is a really difficult balancing act. You know, there's some urgency because what we're talking about is problems that are affecting people's lives, but you don't want to rush in all willy-nilly and actually mess things up. So that's where he gets the patient urgency. But he's also talking about a need to balance, that you got to keep momentum. If people think nothing's happening but planning, you're going to lose people, because some people are beyond planning. You give me an action agenda, I'm coming. If you're talking about doing another planning process, I ain't doing that. Now, one way of mitigating that is to make sure that you've got some action-oriented things that people who need to get action can do, but you're also being purposeful and trying to have everybody that we're planning and being intentional. We're going to move as fast as we can. In collective impact parlance, those are called quick wins, that you're always looking when you're doing this analysis. You typically will run into a problem where you say, oh my goodness, we got the resources for that, the people are there, the policy, everything is there. Why ain't that happening, right? And you will invariably find those when you're doing your problem analysis and your common agenda and other parts of doing a collaborative process. That's really important that you harvest those, and that becomes a staple part of your work. Some people are tired of talking, and especially some people in these neighborhoods and communities. They've been talked to, planned for, surveyed, focus group to death. And some people in the community say, come to me when we get ready to do something about the problem. And you need to provide that option as well as this patient urgency, because you don't want to lose momentum. So Paul's got a discussion here of how you kind of run through an analysis of patient urgency and maintaining momentum. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. And then the next tool is really, now that you've kind of gone through and you've done an analysis, you've done some preliminary planning, thinking about what are the capacity needs. And you'll see at the very top of this list is what was your biggest challenge, right? So you ain't alone in seeing that as a big challenge, because it's at the top of Paul's list. You have to make sure that there's adequate staff time to do this. This collaborative work is time and labor intensive. And if you're going to short shrift it, you're going to have problems. So think about and figure out how you provide adequate time to the staff members who are assigned responsibility for doing this work to really skill up themselves, to develop the tools, to pull together things. There's a lot of infrastructure work that they're going to be doing in addition to the direct delivery and engagement of people. Also, Paul's asking, think about what skill sets various stakeholder groupers need. Think about organizational, cultural change. One of the things that's going to go on in these processes is you're creating a new structure. And you've got to pay attention to the fact, what do you want the culture to be, and not to back into the culture. We've all done our bureaucratic meetings for various years. They don't work a lot. You need to step back and say, how do we create a culture at this new table that's going to serve our purpose? And let me make a quick point about this, which is John Powell, who's at the UC Berkeley Institute for Othering and Belonging, he doesn't use inclusion anymore. Diversity, equity, inclusion. He uses belonging. And the point that he makes is inclusion means that I'm inviting you to my table to do the things the way that I've always done them at my table. And that's what inclusion has come to mean. He's saying, no, no, no. What this needs to be is about belonging. And if everybody's really going to belong, when people first come to the table, we ask and we think about, how do we create a culture that is going to make everybody here feel like they belong and they own a part of this? And part of that is being very deliberate about just not transplanting administrative, bureaucratic culture into these settings, because they're not going to work. One of the things that I'm increasingly doing is thinking about who the groups are and going out and asking them, what do you do at your meetings to give people a sense of belonging, to keep people coming back? And then I'm sort of trying to figure out, can we incorporate some of those things into our collaborative table? So people come in and say, oh, that's the same thing that we do at our meeting in the neighborhood. We start with a healing exercise, or we start by going through the ground rules, or by acknowledging the land and our ancestors, whatever that is. So it's doing some recognizance, because you're creating a new culture at these collaborative tables, and it can either help you propel you toward your goals, or it can run people away from the table. That I've been to these tables for 20 years. I know predictably what's going to happen. I ain't going to waste my time. So that's what you're thinking about. Also, whether or not there's training that people need in leadership roles or in participatory roles. There's also professional support around the partnership. But thinking consciously about what are the capacity building needs that the people at the table have, and making sure that they understand that you're going to support them in the capacity building. And then finally, I'm going to jump to tool 12, change management. So what you're doing in these new collaboratives is you're introducing people to a whole different process than what they're accustomed to around how change is going to occur. You've moved away from typically the single bureaucratic or nonprofit organization to this collaborative structure. You need to think about managing the change process that people are going to. A little bit of anxiety coming to a table where all the rules seem to be changing, and it used to be I decided things and now there's some shared decision making that I ain't. You got to think about what are people likely to be thinking that I'm losing or I'm gaining, and be mindful of that in the way that you organize the work for folks. So this notion of you can't do all that planning and then not think about how are people going to be exposed, receive, and adapt to the change that we're asking them to make. And recognizing that they're going to be, if you do it right, a significant number of people around the table who are going to feel like my power has been diminished. And that's usually one of the greatest factors. I run a $750 million organization, and you're asking me to share decision making with somebody from the neighborhood. Oh, I ain't even sure what their experience is. That's the sort of thing that may be going on. Or conversely, somebody saying, okay, all of a sudden I've been invited to a table and told that there's equal power out here, and I've not been to a table like that. So what's going on here? What does that really mean? How do I do this? What are Robert's Rules of Order, and why in the hell are y'all using them? They seem like they stifle discussion. You know the litany of things as good as I do. So it's just saying, what are people likely to be experiencing as they're coming to this table, and how do you erect scaffolding to manage that sort of change that people are going through, not only in terms of what they're doing, but how they're thinking about it. And then the very last tool is TRIZ. And if you're not familiar with TRIZ, and I'm relatively new to it, I've only learned about it in the last year, but there is an explanation and an exercise here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if you are going to pull together a team to work on helping you to design a collaborative or community engagement process, I strongly recommend that you spend time using this exercise, because essentially what it does is it starts people in the space that a lot of us are, because we've all had bad experience. It just starts people in a process of starting by saying, if you wanted to purposely create the worst community engagement process in the world, what would you do? And most of us know, because we've experienced it, either because we've orchestrated it or we've been on the other end. And what the TRIZ exercise does is it gets all of that out on the table in a non-threatening way for everybody to see. Look, we all know what's going on and what goes wrong in these meetings. Let's get it all out on the table, and let's work through a process of how we don't do stupid things like we've all laughed at ourselves for doing in the past. It's a great way to open people up and to give them a level of comfort in dealing with the fact, and I'm saying this isn't Paul, that we screwed this up historically, right? And this is a way of getting all that on the table without pointing to people who may have orchestrated that. But we all have a laugh and say, okay, we know what has been bad and what we've done wrong. Let's move to a conversation of what to do right. Little over time, sorry on that. But I wanted to walk you through this whole series of tools so that you get a sense of, it's not only a series of tools, it's a process for helping you to plan how you want to do your community engagement. So I'm going to take just a couple more minutes because I want to introduce you to, here's the work plan. I'm sorry. Paul's just gone through and kind of highlighted all 12 of the tools, and in the format of helping you to take what you have discussed and harvest it and put it into a plan. But next slide, I don't know if it's the next or two down, Lydia. Yeah, keep going because I want to get to the, okay, back one. So in Paul's toolkit, this is the International Association for Participation. They are the creator of the spectrum of engagement. And Paul, for his purposes, used one. I like the original, and I'm going to quickly tell you why. The first thing it does is it not only talks about what your stance is toward the community. Are you ignoring them, informing them, consulting with them? Oh, I lost the video. Sorry about that. Consulting them, involving them, collaborating, or deferring. The reason I like it, though, is look at the rest of them. It talks about what the likely impact of that stance toward community engagement is going to be, and something you should know in making a decision about where you're going to position your work. Secondly, it articulates what the community engagement goals are for that type of engagement. It also identifies what is the likely message to the community when you position the work there. And the kind of activities that you're likely to be engaging in if you're situating yourself at that position on the spectrum. And then finally, the resource allocation. What are likely to be the use of whatever resources are available if you're kind of ignoring it all the way over to deferring to community ownership. Now, let me say a couple things really quickly. There are not a lot of situations where, for legal or policy reasons, you're going to be able to defer to the community, and whatever gets created, give it to community. Those are unlikely, although when we were meeting the other day, folks were able to cite one or two examples where that happened. So that's the end of the spectrum, the high end. Not a lot of stuff goes on there, but there are examples. My examples have come from work that I did on community benefits agreements in Oakland and San Francisco, where that was an outgrowth of it, that the community owned the benefits we were able to negotiate. They owned and created the mechanism that would administer those resources and allocate those, and they're managing the long-term investment that the community won, where they get a percentage of every market rate house sold in Bayview Hunters Point, that kind of thing. So it is possible, but they're unlikely. The point I want to make to you is this: no matter, you need to sit down with leadership and figure out what it is that you're going to promise the community and be consistent with that promise. So if you know at best we're going to be able, all we can agree to is a level of involvement, that they'll have voice, will ensure community needs and assets are integrated. If you're in that involved thing, that's what you need to tell the community, and you need to stick. Where people get in trouble is because we're a little nervous about this, and because we're trying to build credibility for past bad practice, we overpromise. And it actually operates to our disadvantage, because the community says, geez, just another broken promise. That's all we get from these folks. So it's going to exacerbate. What I tell my clients and people I work with, you have a policy level decision with whoever the ultimate decision makers are, and you reach agreement on what you can promise, and you stay consistent with that. Also recognize some things may be just, I wouldn't use ignore, but you're just going to inform the community. Yet that's what the obligation is, and for whatever reason you've decided. Because keep in mind, folks in these communities have been dealing with y'all forever. They know kind of who you are and what you do, right? So, and they can deal with the fact that, hey, here's one where we're just going to do an informed process. We're going to let you know that we had to make a decision. People accept that. They know who's got power, right? But they can't tolerate being lied to and being deceived to get to a table, being promised one thing, and then the bait and switch happen. So that's the biggest thing when I work with people that I want them to get is, whoever the team is that's making decisions, y'all sit down and figure out exactly where it's going to be. And there may be one aspect of the work that's over in the consultative part of the spectrum and another collaborate, but understand what you're doing in various parts of the work and clearly communicate the message around that. Let me stop at this point. I know I've poured a lot on. I want to open it up for questions or comments. And then I want to spend some time giving you time to talk about the spectrum in small groups. But floor is open for questions. You can either raise your hand and get unmuted, or you can put it in chat. Floor is open. Questions, comments, critiques, whatever. Anything?
Junious, I didn't hear you say very much about creating an environment of shared power and level setting for that. Could you speak on that for just a moment?
Yeah. So for me it borders on the structure piece as well as the power piece, and I tend to combine them. And I'll just tell you what I'm trying to do now. One of the things is, no matter what the collaborative table is, you need to make a promise to people that you're going to shift and share power beyond those who have historically had it at these sort of tables. And that means moving out from the bureaucrats to share and shift power to CBOs, to unaligned residents, to other stakeholders who are at the table. One of the ways, though, because of the credibility problem that we often have in terms of past practices, one of the things that I'm recommending clients do is a way that you forcefully communicate that as you make the majority of the table the groups that have historically been disadvantaged, right? Or marginalized. Because that sends a message. People presume that we're going to vote, right? Even though I don't think voting is the best way to make decisions, and I quickly come in afterwards and try to convince people that we go to a consensus model. But what that says to people is there is an effort to change the balance of power, because people look around the room and they say, oh, we've got 14 community folks and 10 bureaucrats. What do we all interpret? Oh, the weight of the power is with those 14. Now, whether in fact that becomes the reality or not, we all know the dynamics at this table, but we're trying to communicate people that we're attempting to do something different. We're attempting to shift power. The big players in the room who've always had power, they're the ones that you've got to convince to behave differently at the table and to share power. And as my colleague points out in the article that we wrote in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, you got to keep them from leaving the table. Because what happens with a lot of powerful people, oh, I ain't going to have my regular power. They're just like the rest of us. I ain't staying at a table where I've got no power or diminished power. So you're going to do all that stuff, that's fine. I ain't coming to the meetings. All of a sudden you got my deputy or you got my deputy's assistant at the table rather than the power broker. So you need to court and care for those people to say, do you want to tackle this big problem, right? This is the way that we're going to tackle the big problem. You're going to have to give up a little of that power and share it with folks. You got to listen differently. So it's care and management of the powerful that is a likely part of getting that transition done. That goes back to what I said a few minutes ago about change management. Figure out who those people are and get to them and see what it is that would make them comfortable, because and I know that everybody's into this is not a zero-sum game, all of this stuff. I'm having trouble navigating that. There is, in most of these situations, a finite amount of power, and if you're one person or group has got it and you're shifting it, yeah, somebody's going to have a diminution in power. These people who think there's no zero-sum game, I'm open to being educated, but I don't see that, right? I don't see that as being the reality. So you got to very carefully. If you go back and look at the Stanford Social Innovation Review article, there are some pieces there, and in the other folks that pieces that were done in that series that talk about some specific strategies to try to shift and share power at the table.
We'll put that link in the chat for everyone in just a minute.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So what I want to do is we're going to break into some small groups, and give me just a moment while I do my time check on things. But what I'd like to do is break us into some smaller group. And if you look at your agenda on item 9, you'll get a sense of what we are going to do. We're going to break into at least 4, maybe more small groups there, Lydia. However many we need to get down to maybe about 6 or so people. And you're going to have about 20 minutes in the small group. I would ask each of the groups, no, I'm sorry, I didn't do a slide on this, Lydia. That's for another section. I want to just do the breakout here. You've got it on your agenda sheet, on your participant agenda. So we're going to break down into small groups, ask people to get a note taker or reporter. At the end of the session, we'll go around and just ask everybody to give us a couple of headlines from their discussion. But what I want you to do, and you have a copy of it on your agenda, right? On the last page of your agenda. What I want you to do is when your organization does its own community engagement work, or when it works with a partner, is providing support to others, because I know people are in different situations, where is the focus on the spectrum of community engagement? Where are you trying? What's your target on that spectrum, right? And what are the factors? Or secondly, I want you to ask, do you want to change where your focus is in your organization on that spectrum? So where are we now? Where would we like to be? Then I want you to talk a little bit about what factors are interfering or facilitating with you focusing where you would like your focus to be. And then finally, what needs to happen to move to the desired or preferred focus? Okay, so we'll put you in groups. You have those questions. And this is just to share with each other where we're here. We'd like to be here. Here's what I think is going on that may keep us from getting there or help us to get there. And that's why we want you to get down to about 6 people in the group so that you've got some time on those. Someone has pasted the breakout questions, and we'll set the timer. And we're going to give you about, so we're 20, 30, let's give 15 minutes for folks in those small groups. So if you'll set the timer for 15 minutes, we'll give you 15 minutes. And again, when we come back, we'll spend a little time asking for people to share headlines and observations from the time in the small group. So you can go ahead, Lydia, and assign them over to their groups, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Just a reminder, please get a recorder and a reporter for your groups. And if you're not going to participate and you're going to step away from your computer, if you could just decline the invitation, so people know who's in the group and who to engage. Thank you.
Right. See you soon.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll just let everyone rejoin the room, and then we will start up again. I do hate when that happens to me. I get too excited, and then get myself back into the main room when I'm in a really nice conversation. Oh, I think I put the wrong thing here. So I'm going to put our questions up again so that we can have those up for when we debrief.
Okay, sorry about that. I forgot to unmute. Welcome back, folks. What we want to do is to go around and get some sense of what you talked about in the small groups. And I frame this as headlines. So could the reporter from each of the group just give us a couple of your headlines, and then we'll open it up to other folks who were in that group to add any that they want, and then we'll try to get through that and leave some time then for a couple minutes of open discussion. So the first group, anyone, and I don't know the numbers, so you just jump in. The first person to want to give us some headlines from their group? Somebody want to break the ice? Anyone?
I'll break the ice.
Okay.
It's okay. I'm not exactly shy. Um, I wanted to say that our group was actually pretty diverse, but not. The only other person from my county was in the same breakout group as me. And we're policy and program specialists with child welfare in Tulare County. So we're actually kind of on that front runner of trying to engage communities, government side of things. And then we had a therapist from community-based agency. If I got that a little bit wrong, please forgive me, and you'll have the chance to tell me. And a foster youth representative and mentor, which is what we really need in terms of engaging communities in our efforts to incorporate FFPSA. So I thought that that was absolutely interesting. And one of the things that I think that I saw with our therapist and the needs to happen, talked about things like government agencies, people, executives that are applying for grants, doing a pre-game rather than a post-game when it comes to applying for a grant. And they apply for the grant, and then they go back and they tell the community, okay, we got this money, so this is what we need. And I kind of find that the same way in child welfare. We get, here's the money, go do something. And many times we've been the type of agency that says, let's build it and then present it to the community. And our foster youth representative, I mean, it was talking about things that need to happen, and expanding foster youth supports into even schools like elementary schools, because the support that is given at the late high school, college level, kind of on that ILP level, is a support that would still benefit an elementary school child. And just feeling like the needs in their community for more motivated people to help other youth.
Okay. Are there other people from that group who want to add any other headlines that Janet didn't note? Okay. Thank you, Janet. I did note that y'all sort of got into the substance of the conversation of what happens when you bring different people together, which is all of a sudden people start to talk about, from my perspective, this or that needs to be there. So people will help you kind of identify what the infrastructure needs to look like for the problem. But again, just be cautious that you're doing two things at once. You've got to build the infrastructure and engage people in helping you to build the infrastructure for good collaboration, but also leaving open the door for people to share with you how they think, how they define the problem and how they want to attack it. So you always got those dual things going on, and you need to make sure that you're managing both. Other folks from that group, anybody want to add anything else before we move to another group? Okay, thanks, Janet. Next group, somebody want to share with us some headlines from their group?
we were actually group 4, but I can share now. So anyway, we had a great group. We had a charter school representative, a promotora representative, and an FRC Family Resource Center outreach person. And each one looked at their engagement level, and it was involving, consulting, involving, informing, consulting, and everyone talked about how to move to that next level, how to get to that empowerment, which is where people really want to go. And one of the things that someone mentioned was, how do you support the workforce so that the workforce is comfortable, the folks that are going out and actually meeting with the community members can gain that trust. How can they give them the kind of help them feel less intimidated to engage at those higher levels of these like meetings where you're talking about the folks that are actually managing programs, board member levels, things of that nature, that can be very intimidating. So we talked a little bit about, how to empower people so that they feel comfortable. And a couple of things were, when do you have the meetings? What's the language issue? Do you use a lot of acronyms? Things like that. So those were just some of the stuff that we talked about. And I welcome our other folks to pipe on in.
Other folks in that group, anybody want to add any other headlines?
Can I just add something really quick to something that you said, Barbara, about trust? And I love that, yes, I think it's important to gain the trust of the community. And I think as people doing the work, it's important that we actually build trust in the community. So in their skills that they bring, I think sometimes I see that happening where it's like, well, what will they bring to the table? How can we use this information? So sometimes that trust is not there. So trusting in the community, if that makes sense. And I think the other thing that you mentioned that I saw in action recently, I'm gonna highlight one of the teams that I'm supporting, Orange County. They had a meeting with some community organizations, and the person facilitating the meeting did something that I thought was really amazing, but just said, reminded people not to use acronyms, and he actually defined acronyms that were being used before. That was such a great call out, and I just wanted to highlight that stuff is happening with community, and I just think it's a great reminder.
I would simply add that everybody talks about trust. The road to trust is respect, and we sometimes forget that in these enterprises. And having worked in a number of environments where trust was hard, right? I worked monitoring a federal consent decree where everybody hated me because I worked for the court. I did school desegregation where everybody hated me because I worked for the court. It wasn't an issue that I was going to able to establish trust with them, but I was able to establish respect, right? Which got us into the room and working on it. We never probably got to a level of trust, but we got to a basic level of respect where we could get the work done that the court demanded that we do. So I'm just saying nothing is better than having trust, right? But you can't jump to trust. You've got to build it. And part of that is some basic respect and communication of that level of respect to people so that there's a willingness to entertain the possibility of trust. Anybody else from that group want to highlight anything before we move on? Okay, next group, and we're not going in order because I don't know the numbers of the order, so just jump in if you want to report for your group.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry. I have no idea what group number. I didn't even know we had numbers. So I'll start off by saying that. But this is Rachel Kazine. I am with the County of Riverside with Public Social Services with the Children's Services Division, and also in our group was Stephanie Beegler. I don't want to butcher your last name. And she is with the Child Abuse Prevention Centers. And then we had Evan Hodges, who is a community outreach staff. Sorry, Evan, I forgot your exact title, with San Diego County. And then and then coincidentally, we had Gloria Cervantes, who is a supervisor with First Five with the Family Resource Centers. And she and I have never met, but we are both with the same county, and obviously with FFPSA, we will definitely be collaborating. So this was a great opportunity for us to connect. So I think, and I know this from my personal experience in working with San Diego, but also from what Evan shared. San Diego County is definitely ahead of the curve in terms of their community engagement. They're much more, I would say, Evan was, I think, being modest. He was saying somewhere around consult, involve, but I feel like from my working with them, they're much closer to involve, collaborate. They are doing a phenomenal job of the community engagement piece. And then I think I think Stephanie also was sharing that they, while they are having some really good, strong community engagement efforts, she wasn't feeling like maybe they were quite at the level that Junious was speaking about in terms of those community members really feeling that sense of belonging versus inclusion. And so maybe the quote unquote, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have my camera on, I apologize. The quote unquote, connections or engagement might not really be at the level that they would like to be, or where they are telling themselves that they are. And then for Riverside County, we're kind of around, we hover between inform, consult, and involve. It really depends on, which sector of the community, and which part of our agency is doing the outreach and trying to make that connection. So it can really vary, but it is something that we are really, really focusing on between FFPSA, and then we also, separate from FFPSA, although there is an intersection there, we are completely overhauling our hotline and referral process to be much more, hopefully much more preventative versus being an intervention. So that's really our goal, but we're far from there yet. And we did discuss FFPSA as a whole in its entirety as this massive, I just keep referring to it as a massive beast, but this really, beautiful, fantastic idea, concept that we all shared, that we feel though that it is so comprehensive and so complex, and oftentimes even the language provided by the state or by the feds is so high level that it's really hard to kind of boil that down to an action item. What is the process going to be for us to execute X, Y, and Z? And we were pretty passionate about wanting to share that up north to SAC in the hopes that somebody hears us, because we want this to be a successful endeavor, but there do seem to be some hurdles there. So that was, and group, I'm sorry if I've miscommunicated anything or if I left anything out, guys, please jump in here. I certainly don't want to misspeak on behalf of our group or omit any pertinent thoughts.
Anyone else from that group want to add any other headlines? Stephanie?
Oh, I was applauding Rachel on what she was saying, but just our concern is that the complexity of the FFPSA detracts from this incredible process that we just heard today for the best way to engage the community. And if there wasn't so much distraction and anxiety around the FFPSA and the comprehensive prevention plan, then there would be a little bit more freedom to be able to go ahead and to be more intentional about the plan that you just outlined, Junious.
Okay.
Thanks, Robin.
Alrighty. So I want to move ahead. We're running short on time. I want to make sure we get everybody's report out. The Next group, somebody else want to report out and give us some headlines from their discussion?
I will. We had some folks with us that are really engaged in this type of work, and I'm going to call some of them out because I think that what they're doing is just amazing. So there's Shang Yang, who's a case manager at an FRC, Robin Davis, who's with the CAPC in Calaveras County, and Cynthia Sutcliffe, who has a very unique role in that she's the president of the CAPC and she's consulting with child welfare on FFPSA. I hope I got that right, Cynthia. But that pregame concept is one of the things that these folks have been doing. They've been engaged in this prevention work for many years and really used an upstream approach that I would love to have Cynthia talk about if she would be willing to unmute herself. But it's very similar to what 90 by 30 in Lane County, Oregon did, where they had focus groups and key informant interviews, and they got a lot of information from the community before going back and saying, okay, how are we going to have this inform our strategies? And then coming back again with those strategies and asking the community which of these programs would best meet your needs, and letting them have that voice. Did I capture that well, Cynthia? Do you want to unmute and speak?
Lola, you got it exactly. And like Lola said, we've been working on this since 2018, so this isn't something new. We are engaged with the Humboldt Network of Family Resource Centers. We're very blessed in Humboldt County to have 17 of them. We've also been able to partner with 3 of the 8 federally recognized tribes in Humboldt County. The Family Resource Centers, 3 of them are also going to be conducting focus groups that are actually going on right now with families with lived experience in the Spanish-speaking community. So we have English-only focus groups, we have Spanish focus groups, and we have Native American focus groups all going on, as well as doing an online survey asking pretty much the same kind of questions to our foster youth, former foster youth, and our crossover probation youth, to be able to find out exactly what they feel needs to be incorporated into the comprehensive prevention plan. When we get this information back, then we're going to distill it and then go back to each of those individual communities and work with them on creating a piece of the plan that reflects what their families came up with. We think that there's going to be some general crossover there where things will be kind of the same across the county, but there will definitely be unique needs within each of these communities that we want to make sure the comprehensive prevention plan addresses. So the plan's probably going to be really, really long. Anyway, no, I'm just kidding.
So I want to underscore that point though, because that's one of the most difficult things that people have in trying to do equity work, is going through all of the analysis with all the subpopulations, understanding how each group got situated where they are, and then all of a sudden we go to strategy and we do a universal. And I will argue that those universal strategies are more likely to exacerbate disparities than they are to reduce them. So what she is describing there is absolutely essential. You can't go through and disaggregate and understand everybody's specific population level problem and then ignore it when you do. We've got to get comfortable in the same way this society has been really comfortable in identifying subpopulation and visiting misery on them. We got to be equally as comfortable with identifying populations and visiting wholeness and wellness and repair of what we've done to them. You can't drop all of that. So I appreciate what Cynthia is saying. Engage the community to get their understanding of what was going on and why the situation exists, some of which only they know because they've been on the other side of some of the discrimination that we've done, but going back to them and trying to engage them, are these the right interventions? That's absolutely critical, and that's what's going to yield results. I think there are 1 or 2 more groups, so I want to jump ahead. Any other groups that haven't reported out? If so, just jump in.
I'll report out real quickly for our group. It was interesting because one of the things I've thought about this tool is the fact that it has you look at your history as well as where you want to go. Like, what did we do with regards to outreach? How can we change that? And where do we want to go? Because the first person brought up how outreach is kind of difficult right now. And they have really seen that families that come to them or families that come to them for resources or things like that are a resource to continue to assist to get others there. So that was a very interesting perspective. We had someone in our group who is the equity consultant for Indiana, and she is tasked with bringing 92 counties together in developing their suicide outreach and suicide hotlines, and was talking about how the focus groups, we've got to go beyond the focus groups. The focus groups have brought the folks in, but now in moving to that real level of engagement, we've got to do some other things to make sure that they stay there. The other piece was his one concept that was really interesting was that person mentioned the fear of hearing what they needed to do and then not being able to produce. So getting that information back from the community and then not knowing if we have all of the things in place to produce. And Junious, I know that's when you talk about being honest of what we can give and where we can go with this stuff. So group, add anything else, because everybody else thought they had the best group and we know that we did. So add anything else that we need to bring in.
Other headlines from Troy's group? Okay, and I would just underscore what Troy said. Admitting that you have screwed up in the past is absolutely essential to, if that's the case. Now, some of you may have done everything right and you got no culpability for anything you get wrong. I salute you. But for most of us mortal humans, we got to admit that, boy, I really messed that up. But now we're in relationship and you need to help me not repeat the same errors again. That builds a lot of credibility, because we don't often tell folks, especially we're in client relationships, that I screwed up about you, right? That builds some credibility because they know we've screwed up about them. So it's not like we're telling any new stories. People know where we've had systemic failure. So that's a really important element, is just going ahead and copping that plea and saying, but we ain't living there. Where we're living is, how do we work together in the future to make sure that I don't screw up and that you don't screw up either? Because quite as it's kept, all of us have some of those things on our, quote, rap sheet that we did really well and that we didn't do so well. So other people from that group or the final group, I think there's one more. Or did everybody get out? Okay. Wow. I'm sorry. We're almost out of time, and there were a couple things I still wanted to do. One of which was to provide some time for Michael, and I'm not sure who was doing it, but to show the resource and context slides. Do we have time to do that, or do we need to cut, Lydia?
I think we could probably share a couple of just important reminders as for folks that are engaging in this comprehensive prevention planning process. So I will turn it over to our team and they can talk a little bit more about the requirements in comprehensive prevention planning when it comes to engaging communities.
And I'm glad to pick that up. I'm Michael Williams. I'm the policy director at the Child Abuse Prevention Center, which allows me to be involved with all of this great work. For those of you who are doing county level planning, you know you got an all county letter from the Office of Child Abuse Prevention that really describes the priority of community engagement. And part of what will be required are efforts to engage tribes, to consult individuals and families with lived experience, to prioritize those disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system, and to document any barriers to engagement. And as we've really heard here, that will be great for your comprehensive plan, for your plans to be comprehensive and sustained and to have impact. we've really learned how we need to do more than document barriers or just try, but that it's going to be essential to have that real relationship, whatever it takes.
Thank you.
And then just very quickly, we will send this in the follow-up email, but just wanted to share the prevention resource guide. This was released by the Department of Health and Human Services, and they do talk about prevention planning. There's a couple of chapters within that guide that I think are very specific to what we had spoken about today, and that is creating a more supportive society for families. So looking at how to, really engage families in this process, but also when you're doing the planning around this, how do you sort of think about some of these things like social determinants of health and really creating the conditions for family success. And then also chapter 5 really talks about embracing community and the wisdom of lived experience, and not just lived experience as a caveat to what you're doing, but that it is an actual tool that you're using in order to really look at the services that you're planning for your communities. So a really great resource. It's in the chat. We've dropped it in the chat. And if you're not able to download it, it will be in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah. So Lydia, just to close, a couple of quick recommendations to folks. The first recommendation is absolutely do not reinvent the wheel. Don't start from ground zero. You've got colleagues who are doing the work that have already started doing it. Steal, plagiarize, borrow, whatever term you use from them. There are a bunch of tools. If you start at ground zero building this up, you're never going to get to the destination. Secondly, pull together. What I would do if I were working with a group like you or individuals is first thing I'd want is pull together a representative team that reflects where we want to go in the way that we engage people and bring them to a table and go through either my situational analysis questions, there are some slides on, or through the workbook, and have that group go and build knowledge and understanding and a plan. Make sure you get the right staff people at the table. Somebody mentioned this. I go into situations and I say, how in the hell did that person get designated to do this work? They don't like community. They don't believe in this. It was some bureaucratic assignment. Death knell. So get the right people there and support them. Somebody else was talking about this. They should get dispensation. They should get compensation, but that's another matter. But they really should get the support and resources they need to do this work, and the flexibility in turn hours. They're likely to go on night shift. There's a bunch of stuff that if we really want people to be successful, we need to do that. And what I suggested before, if you pull together a group, start with the TRIZ exercise, a great exercise to surface all of those things that people are thinking about and doing. And again, please, I'm sorry we ran out of time, but please feel free. You've got my email and a phone number. If there's something you'd like to follow up on, I'd be glad to talk with you further. Back to you, Lydia. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Junious, for your time and your wisdom and your lived expertise on how to engage community. We truly appreciate it. I want to just highlight very quickly, a couple of events that are coming up in our Reimagining Prevention series. One is Leading Through Change, Shifting Towards a Prevention Mindset, brought to you by Caltrin. That is next week from 10 to 11:30. And I think that Caltrin has done some excellent change management webinars, and I know that there is another one still in the series. And excuse me, we are also doing one on tools for comprehensive prevention planning, driver diagrams, and theories of change, which is part of the comprehensive prevention planning process. So we just wanted to highlight those two. Those can be found on our website at strategies.org, strategiesca.org, and also caltrin.org as well. So we'll put those links in the email that you will receive. So again, just to reiterate, we will send a survey link. There should be one coming in the chat. If you have time to fill that out, please do so. This helps us, forms us for our next webinar. You also get all of the materials and links that have been shared today in an email. And we just encourage you to keep checking our website, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So this will also be posted on YouTube if you wanted to share with your colleagues. And just keep in touch with us and register for the next events that are coming up. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm sorry we went a little over time, but we appreciate the rich discussion that we had this afternoon, and we will see you at the next event. Take care, everyone.